Intelligence background. From an American perspective, the Cuban crisis begins with the intelligence gathering procedures, which made it possible to discover the existence of the offensive missiles and other Soviet arms shortly after their arrival in Cuba. In late 1961, the intelligence community was instructed to increase its efforts to gather information about developments in Cuba. To accomplish that purpose, a number of steps were taken, among them these. This effort began before there was any indication of the massive Soviet arms buildup in Cuba. It was not related to it as such. Until these steps were taken, and up to the end of March 1962, the intelligence community and other high government officials recognized that it was expected that the measure adopted would provide significantly more information by July. It was this series of measures which placed the intelligence community in a position of readiness when the Soviet buildup began in late July and early August. A broad range of intelligence sources were utilized. Each type of source contributed to the intelligence mosaic. These had to be carefully sifted and evaluated, but did yield some useful information. A few scattered reports referring to missiles were received as early as 1961. The few exceptions could not be confirmed or disproved by any other means. However, the evidence on conventional Soviet weaponry going to Cuba, such as tanks, artillery, and aircraft, was entirely consistent with other information available on arms shipments through the first half of 1962. From mid-1962 on, a large volume of intelligence data was being received. Beginning in August, a small but growing percentage of the total concerned the secret influx of conventional weapons and related activities. The smaller but more rapidly growing portion proved that when checked to refer to the introduction of defensive missiles, it was not until after mid-September that some bits of information were suggestive of Soviet offensive missiles, and they were not evaluated as such when first received. There were a few reports of missiles in August, all of which were linked to SAM or cruise missile deployments, or shown to be incorrect. After late August, there were increasing numbers of such reports, as well as some of MiG-21s and IL-28s. Various bits of information received by the end of August added up to a pattern that included the arrival of a large number of block ships carrying military cargoes and several thousand block personnel, widespread and large-scale construction activity, convoys of Soviet trucks frequently moving by night and carrying tubular objects, new restricted military areas from which Cuban residents had been evacuated, Soviet personnel supervising unloading of ships and the land transport of the cargo, and exclusively Soviet or bloc occupancy and control of the evacuated sites. The first offensive missiles, MRBMs, probably did not arrive in Cuba until about September 8th. Until mid-September, there were no signs of this or of the Soviet intentions. After mid-September, a few reports of varying reliability and precision were suggestive enough to arouse suspicions. Internal dissemination of intelligence information. Information on the Soviet arms buildup in Cuba was widely circulated in the intelligence community and to top-level officials of the government. The speed of dissemination of information within the government was high. From early September, there were some restrictions on dissemination of information within the government about Soviet weapons in Cuba. These did not affect the flow of raw data to the analysts or to decision-making officials at the highest level. Quite apart from the restrictions, no information on offensive missiles was available until October 15th, was hard enough to permit writing of a credible item for dissemination. The restrictions on dissemination, publishing within the intelligence community, were the result of an instruction from the Director of Central Intelligence that all reports relating to a possible Soviet arms buildup in Cuba should be subjected to verification to the greatest possible extent. This was interpreted to mean that reports on this subject should not be published and thus brought to the attention of the normal recipients of intelligence data circulated within the government unless they had been so verified. The first instruction that intentionally restricted publication was issued at the end of August, when some SAM sites and another site, the nature of which could not be immediately determined, and which subsequent analysis showed to be a defensive cruise missile installation. On August 31st, the President ordered that there be no publication within the intelligence community of this information until our course of policy was determined. The information continued to be available to intelligence analysts and a small number of top decision makers. On September 4th, the President publicly announced the presence of a missile defense system in Cuba. Thereafter, information on SAMs was disseminated in intelligence community publications. In early October, firm evidence of a shipment of IL-28s going into Cuba was obtained. Because of the bomber's offensive capability, White House permission was needed to publish information on it within the intelligence community. It was granted, and the information was published on October 11th. At the time this permission was granted, the President directed the Director of Central Intelligence to put into effect a system of rigid control of information on offensive weapons. The U.S. Intelligence Board established a special classification system on October 12th, which provided that information on offensive capabilities in Cuba should be disseminated only to specific individuals on an eyes-only basis, who by virtue of their responsibilities as advisors to the President have a need to know. There is no intent thereby to inhibit the essential analytic process. The system stayed in effect until after the President's speech on October 22nd. Its effect within the intelligence community was to confine raw information on offensive weapons in Cuba to U.S. Intelligence Board principals and the analysts working directly on the problem. The estimates on Cuba. In January, March, August, and September, the intelligence community produced estimates on Cuba. Each considered possibility of Soviet use of Cuba as a strategic base. Each concluded the Soviets would consider the risk of U.S. retaliation too great. The estimates were based on three basic calculations. Soviet policy was to avoid a risk of confrontation, which would run risks of losing Cuba or chance of war. 2. The Soviets hoped to win victory for communism by other than military means. This policy would be impaired by establishment of a strategic base on Cuba. 3. The Soviet military buildup, as known to us before September 19, 1962, appeared consistent with these policies. The September 19th estimate viewed the purpose of military buildup as then known as being to strengthen the Cuban regime against presumed U.S. attempts to overthrow it. Air defense and coastal defenses increased Castro's security and thus his strength at home, and so permitted him to carry on more aggressive revolutionary activity in Latin America. The estimate said that the Soviets might add weapons like submarines and light bombers of a more offensive character. It also stated that the Soviets could derive military advantage from placing medium or intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba, or from a submarine base. It considered the latter more likely, but considered both incompatible with Soviet practice to date. It pointed out that Latin Americans would fear and resent Soviet military intrusion into the hemisphere, and said that if it became clear the Soviets were establishing an offensive base in Cuba, most Latin American governments would expect the United States to eliminate it by whatever means were necessary. This whole section is blank. The weather again refused to cooperate from October 10th to 13th. It was checked daily, but forecasts were unfavorable. The mission authorized at the October 9th meeting. By late afternoon on October 15th, the first days, skilled analysts at the contained unmistakable evidence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba. Site construction appeared to be well underway for an installation near San Cristobal, about 100 miles west of Havana. The missiles were tentatively identified as being of at least 700 and possibly 1,000 mile range. In the course of the evening, this information was made available to high officials of the Departments of State and Defense, the intelligence community, and the White House. Among those who were informed by telephone or word of mouth were Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick, General Joseph Carroll, Director of Defense Intelligence Agency General Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Undersecretary of State George Ball, Deputy Undersecretary of State Alexis Johnson, Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Edwin Martin, State Department Director of Research and Intelligence Roger Hilsman, Director of Central Intelligence John McCone, his deputy General Marshall Carter, and White House Special Assistant McGeorge Bundy. Secretary Rusk took the call from Hilsman at a phone outside the formal dining room in the State Department, where he was a host at a dinner for German Foreign Minister Schroeder. Assistant Secretary Martin was informed by telephone at the National Press Club shortly after he finished an address to the Washington chapter of Sigma Delta Chi on the Cuban situation. Sigma Delta Chi Foundation of Washington, D.C. is a non-profit education arm of the Washington, D.C. professional chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the nation's oldest and largest organization of journalists. Several were informed at a private dinner at Fort McCair McNair quarters of General Taylor. Others were reached at their homes. The photo interpreters continued to work through the evening, examining and analyzing their findings. During the night, they prepared a written report on what had been learned for presentation to the president first thing the next morning. Early the next morning, there were meetings of intelligence officers and high policy officials at the Defense and State Departments. At 9 a.m., McGeorge Bundy presented the evidence to the president in his bedroom. He straightaway ordered that a meeting be convened at the White House at 11:45. Those attending included most of the individuals who had been informed the previous evening, with the addition of the Vice President, Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and Presidential aide Theodore Sorensen. It was the first meeting of the group that came to be known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or formerly EXCOM. General Carter, Deputy Director of the CIA, gave a detailed briefing on the basis of the evidence, stating that the October 14th showed the presence of a probably not yet operational mobile MRBM launch site in Cuba. He said that the evidence of the presence of offensive missiles on the island, while unmistakable, was fragmentary. It was not known how extensive a deployment had been made, or how near to operational the missiles might be. Accordingly, it was agreed that blank should be greatly increased to obtain comprehensive coverage of Cuba as quickly as possible. Surveillance, right? All restrictions blank were removed. The president ordered that blank carried out on an unlimited basis, some mostly successful. That afternoon and thereafter, every morning at 8:30, the United States Intelligence Board met to draw together all intelligence strands. On the afternoon of the 16th, it directed the Guided Missile and Astronautics Intelligence Committee, GMAC, to prepare an immediate evaluation. The GMAC evaluation concluded that the missiles were clearly under Soviet control and that there was no evidence that nuclear warheads were present in Cuba. It also noted that the missile installations that had been identified did not yet appear to be operational. Already at this early moment, the close relation between policy planning and intelligence information can be noted. Secretary Rusk and others have observed that both the timing of our response and the actions initiated were closely related to the intelligence and indications of what was happening in Cuba. Meetings and conferences took place through the rest of the day in the intelligence community and the Departments of Defense and State. At State, a meeting took place in the afternoon with Ambassadors Bolin and Thompson, both formerly ambassadors to the Soviet Union, and UN Ambassador Stevenson in attendance. At 6:30, there was another meeting at the White House. A late meeting at the State Department concluded in the Secretary's office after 11 p.m. It was decided that very tight security should be maintained until the full implications of the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba had been plumbed, and until the U.S. response was worked out. Wednesday, October 17th was a blur of meetings for the main policy group, located mainly in Undersecretary Ball's conference room at the State Department. John McCone had returned from California by this time and took part in the discussions, as did Ambassador Thompson and Deputy Undersecretary of State Alexis Johnson. The president departed for Connecticut in the afternoon to keep a campaign commitment. In the morning, he had a meeting with McCone and Bundy. It was a day of full and free discussion, according to one of the participants, with no rigid positions, no departmental point of views. The next meeting with the president would not take place until the next morning. Additional information on the missiles was being gathered. This, therefore, was a day of thought and analysis, a day for the weighing of alternatives, for interpretation and conjecture. One of the first suggestions expressed was that the episode be treated like the 1960 U-2 incident, as a mistake by the Kremlin in contradiction of Khrushchev's repeated promises that no offensive missiles would be placed in Cuba. The solution to the mistake was to erase it by an extremely limited airstrike. Most of the group considered the missile deployment an effort to establish a major Soviet base, not primarily to support Castro, an intelligence spokesman argued that the present buildup was probably only a first phase of a very large commitment of Soviet strength in Cuba. It was necessary to assume that nuclear warheads were at hand near the 3 MRBM sites that had been spotted. In addition, many ships were en route from the Soviet Union, and it must be assumed that they carried additional weapons. GMAC estimated that day that 16 and possibly 32 missiles of 1,020 nautical mile range would be operational in about a week. A significant bombing capability also existed. Some 10 IL-28s still in crates, 10 to 20 MiG-21s also in boxes, and 50 to 60 MiG-15, 17, 19s. It was considered probable that Soviet personnel retained full custody of all the weapons, including the SAMs. Another discussant stated the view that by his missile venture, Khrushchev was preparing for a series of showdowns on Berlin, on overseas bases, on disarmament. Successful establishment of an offensive base on Cuba would give the Soviet leader the best chance of coming out ahead. The discovery of the missiles very shortly after their arrival in Cuba and before they were operational jumped the gun on Khrushchev. The advantage of surprise was, for the moment, with us. Several believed that Khrushchev would not be able to maintain his grip on power if he failed to respond strongly to any U.S. action. The least he would do, it was felt, would be to exert pressure on or move against the Jupiter missile installations in Turkey. The other most likely pressure point was Berlin. Much discussion centered on the political versus military approach. Under the political heading came suggestions that Castro, not Khrushchev, should be held responsible, and that an emissary be sent to Castro demanding withdrawal of the missiles. It was asked why Castro should accept such a demand. There was recognition that a political approach to Castro or Khrushchev would inhibit military action, and that any political approach would be effective only if backed by the threat of military force. The rhetorical question was asked, why not relax about the missiles on Cuba, just accept them as another target? The thought was also expressed that there was no intermediate position on the missiles. Either they were tolerated or they were not tolerated. No halfway measure appeared to be logically consistent. Preliminary discussions of an airstrike centered on the number of sorties and bombs that would be required to knock out the Soviet weapons. The point was also made that offensive weapons were our sole target in Cuba. Preliminary discussion of a blockade saw the advantage that this action would permit the crisis then to be put into a political context. On the other hand, it was argued that a blockade was the policy most likely to cause difficulties and divisions among the Western Allies. Before the day closed, there was also some discussion of calling Congress into session, either to recognize a state of war or to emphasize the difference between the action to be taken and war. Thursday, October 18th was a day of activity on several fronts. The president had returned late the previous evening from his campaign trip to Connecticut. Additional blank had been obtained and analyzed. An intelligence estimate put together jointly by the Joint Atomic Energy Intelligence Committee, blank, GMAC stated that it was probable that MRBMs should be launched within 18 hours. Could be launched. This was the first joint evaluation in a series of issued daily until November 11th. The Joint Chiefs of Staffs directed that and ordered SINCPAC to transfer operational control of a reinforced infantry battalion to Sinkland. At 11 a.m., the main policy group met with the president at the White House. The opening discussion concentrated on clarifying the issues, the magnitude of the problem, the risks, the alternatives. What was the effect of the missiles on the overall balance of power? What was Khrushchev up to? Was it our objective to get rid of the missiles, or did it go farther? Did Khrushchev plan to present us with an ultimatum, and if he did, what would be the effect? What could Khrushchev do that would satisfy us? Was it Khrushchev's aim to make us give up our bases in Turkey or to leave Berlin? The legalities of the situation entered the discussion. Cuba is not in the Warsaw Pact, it was pointed out, so measures initiated by the United States would not bring into effect the terms of a formal alliance between Cuba and the USSR. A blockade, it was suggested, partakes more of the quality of legality than an airstrike or invasion. It would have the advantage of not killing any Russians and would permit the issue to be placed subsequently on a political track. Legality, but a tactic. It would have the advantage of not killing any Russians and would permit the use to be placed subsequently on a political track. Firmness, it was agreed, was essential. Time was an important element. Whatever course was to be followed, the more time there was to plan it in detail, the better it was likely to work. But each passing hour increased the chance of a security leak and gave the Soviets additional time to perfect their own plans and operations. It was decided to split informally into two groups to evaluate two possible courses: the slow, involving political measures, and the fast, notification, military action, and then blockade. The president listened, asked questions, probed replies, and gave directions. One participant observed that at the close of a session, the president issued orders firmly. They were his decisions, and he expected them to be obeyed. One firm presidential decision stated at the close of that meeting was that operational Soviet MRBMs in Cuba could not be accepted, for both military and political reasons. This decision was the basis for further discussion among the main policy group, without the president, which continued that afternoon in the Secretary of State's conference room. By this time, former President Eisenhower and Truman had been apprised of the situation and had made their views known to the president, who in turn communicated them to the planners. The choices were beginning to narrow. Of the various options, only one, the pure political track, could be implemented without notifying our allies. The non-military action of sending private letters to Castro and Khrushchev, with the option of then going to the UN, was considered to be of doubtful value. One participant characterized the political approach as going down with a whimper, and thought it better to risk a bang. On the other hand, a possible airstrike raised serious questions. How could one be sure Castro and the Soviet missile commanders understood the message of notification, which would amount to an ultimatum? The suggestion was made that the Swiss be asked to transmit it. The danger to other countries was noted. It was not enough to knock out 16 missiles if in the course of doing so we lost 3 countries. Retaliation against the Guantanamo naval base was a possibility that could not be ignored. There was discussion of the analogies between U.S. bases in Europe and the Soviet penetration into the Caribbean. Some thought that Khrushchev would certainly try to make the removal of his missiles from Cuba a quid pro quo for our withdrawal from Europe. The possibility of a UN team being sent to all the world's missile installations was mentioned, as was the possibility of major negotiations with Khrushchev on all foreign bases. It was generally agreed that the basis of our presence in Europe is significantly different from the Soviet intrusion into this hemisphere. A basic principle of the balance of power in the nuclear age, it was stated, was that sensitive areas such as Berlin, Iran, or Laos should not be turned into missile bases, and that missile installations only be established pursuant to open military alliances such as NATO. In any event, if a launch of nuclear missiles from Cuba should occur, it was recognized that retaliation would be made against the USSR. The trend of thinking during the afternoon was toward the course eventually followed. Notification and a legal blockade backed by the possibility of military action. This was the distillation of 3 days' thought and analysis. Essentially, 5 main lines of action had been considered, separate and in various combinations. They were identified by one participant as 1. Diplomatic pressure but no military action, on the thesis that the weapons in Cuba did not change the overall military equation. 2. A limited surprise airstrike against just the offensive missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads. 3. Blockade. This word, not quarantine, was used up to the moment of the president's address. 4. A massive airstrike against the missile sites as well as bombers, SAMs, and everything else in Cuba of an offensive nature. 5. Invasion. In the early stages of discussion, this was considered to be an ascending order of magnitude, with the blockade considered more extreme action than a limited airstrike. Vice President Johnson had termed a blockade an act of war in a speech as recently as October 6th. Stopping, seizing, and searching a Russian ship on the high seas might have grave consequences. On the other hand, a limited airstrike precisely targeted on the missiles could perhaps be pulled off without a major power confrontation. Possibly it could be treated as the 1960 U-2 episode should have been, in effect to pretend it hadn't happened. We would assume the missiles were in Cuba by mistake. Wiping them out with a few non-nuclear bombs could correct the mistake. That would be the end of the affair on the assumption that the Soviets would not choose to make an issue out of being caught. Red-handed in an embarrassing situation. On the basis, it was thought that an airstrike of a few minutes' duration could destroy all the offensive missiles in Cuba with little damage to surrounding areas and negligible loss of life. Most of the group favored this course of action in the first hours of discussion. The readout taken Wednesday, which is available Thursday, showed that there were more missiles and sites than was thought at first, indicated that none of the missiles were actually operational, nor did they provide hard evidence of the presence of any nuclear nose cones. This more detailed intelligence made it plain that an airstrike to destroy all the offensive missiles would be a major effort, not an affair of a few bombs in a few minutes. Both the diplomatic and military implications of such an operation loomed large. Human beings, both Russians and Cubans, would undoubtedly be killed. U.S. responsibility for the bombing could not possibly be concealed or evaded to any significant extent. Retaliation by the Soviets, or conceivably even the Castro regime, could take unpredictable and catastrophic form.